Hey there, students. Welcome back to Intensive Review, and we are going to go ahead and delve into Standard 3, which involves the Civil War and Reconstruction, and first of all, the causes of the Civil War. This Indicator 3.1 is pretty lengthy because we're really going through the entire antebellum period, and we're going to be looking at a comprehensive view of all of the causes leading up to the Civil War. So get ready for that. And first of all, we start with the Missouri question, because this is the first time where there was controversy over a state trying to enter the Union and the status of slavery in that state. Now, if we look at this map, which I thought was really cool when I made it several years ago, but it doesn't look so great now. But you see that Missouri is trying to get in the Union, and if you follow the trajectory, it seems like Missouri would be a free state. But Missouri wants to come in as a slave state, and there are a lot of Northerners who have a problem with this. Now, of course, this is fixed by a compromise. Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Now, keep in mind, I've got a little segment on your handout where we talk about the great compromiser. His first compromise is the Missouri Compromise in 1820. That is when Clay enters the scene and shows off his talent for compromising. And Clay, in the meantime, and this becomes a sticking point, is Clay's American system. So on one hand, he's a compromiser, but on the other hand, he's an introducer of something that ends up being pretty controversial. And Clay's American system, if we remember NIP, National Bank, Internal Improvements, and Protective Tariff. All right, these are the three parts of Clay's American system. And the South loses, because keep in mind that the South has an agricultural economy at this time. And it is not really dependent on investment or a national bank or developing industry, needs a low tariff because the Southern economy is based on trade. So the South is going to resist this big time. And the nullification controversy happens between 1828 and 1833. This is a result of the Tariff of 1828, which even today is the largest tariff ever passed in U.S. history. And it resulted in the South paying so much more money in taxes because that's where the trade was. And South Carolina decided, you know what, we're going to take a page out of Jefferson's playbook. Remember that playbook that just kind of got pushed aside when Jefferson got elected? We're going to take that page out of the playbook, and we are going to nullify this tariff because a protective tariff is not constitutional. It is never mentioned in the Constitution that it says that Congress can collect taxes and duties and all of that kind of stuff, but it has to pay the debts of the United States, support the common defense, or general welfare. Well, this did none of those. So on the grounds that a protective tariff is unconstitutional, South Carolina does this, but Henry Clay compromises. All right, this is the second compromise, the nullification compromise in 1833. Keep in mind that John C. Calhoun is the dominant figure here in this nullification controversy, but Henry Clay's second compromise was the nullification compromise. And so keep in mind 28 to 33 in response to the Tariff of Abominations in 1828. And so then we see that, oh, okay, yeah, I've got something here. Matthew, if you'll alert me onto this typo while we're keeping track of that. There's a typo on that 1831 line. All right, so the American system again, National Bank, Internal Improvements, Protective Tariff. And keep in mind, we've got these three compromises. All right, so Missouri nullification, and then later we'll get to the Compromise of 1850. So these are the activities of the Great Compromiser. So in 1831, William Lloyd Garrison publishes The Liberator, all right? And this is the beginning of the abolitionist movement in the United States. And this is something that is seen as a cause because anti-slavery movements in the North and the subsequent reaction, the very strong reaction from the South in defense of slavery, this is going to really define that era and move the nation closer to civil war. And then in 1836, Texas is independent. Keep in mind, we let them sit there independent for a little while because we don't want to cause any trouble. Then Manifest Destiny takes over, and in 1845, we have Texas annexation, that the United States brings in Texas to further the cause of Manifest Destiny. Now, keep in mind, as far as cause and effect, the Mexican War is a direct effect of Texas annexation, of the United States annexing Texas. We end up going to war with Mexico for 2 years. And we see that this debate about slavery, which is really tied in with the territorial expansion of the United States. A lot of this is not just ideological debates about slavery, but really kind of a balance of power thing. And the Wilmot Proviso, which is a free soil document that David Wilmot from New York, who was a free soil Democrat from the North, he said that, look, any land that we get from Mexico is going to be closed to slavery. It never passes Congress, but it does draw a line in the sand, and that is why the Wilmot Proviso is still a very important document in U.S. history, because it did articulate this anti-slavery position, and specifically the position of the free soilers. All right, because you've got really two anti-slavery movements in the antebellum United States. The abolitionist movement, which had its geographic base in the Northeast. And this was opposition to slavery in the abstract, full hook, line, sinker. We need to get rid of it now. We need to get rid of it everywhere. And then in the Northwest, it's much more common among these white farmers in the Northwest who want to move even farther west that they want the soil out west to be free. They don't want slave labor there competing with free labor. And they want, really, you see it as a white west, is what I tend to call the free soil movement. They want a white west. And this is opposition to the spread of slavery. We could compare this to containment during the Cold War. So keep in mind that there are two distinct anti-slavery movements, abolitionism and free soil, during this time. And this is a typical free soil document here, that it's not really grounded in morality, and in a lot of ways it's grounded in racism. If you look at this cartoon, you see that the victim is not the black man that is being pushed into the white man's mouth, but the victim is this white farmer who is having his hair pulled, who's having someone shoved down his throat, and he is a victim here. All right, so keep that in mind, that the victim for William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, that would be the slave, whereas the victim for the free soilers would be this Western white farmer. And so the thing is, a big controversy arises after the Mexican War. What are we going to do with the Mexican cession? What are we going to do with these territories? And this ignites a controversy which ends with the Compromise of 1850, put together by Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas. And there are 5 provisions of the Compromise of 1850. So first of all, for the North, California is going to be admitted as a free state. Not as 2 states, a free and a slave state, but as a free state, as a single, humongous, gigantic free state. And in return, the Upper South is going to get a stronger fugitive slave law. This is by far the most controversial element of the Compromise of 1850, because it doesn't include jury trials for these accused slaves. It's a bench trial. Contrary to the Constitution, which guarantees everyone a jury trial. But then again, the legal status of slaves is kind of in question before the 13th Amendment. So as far as the New Mexico territory, when you have something of 5 divided into chunks, so you've got California's free state for the North, then the stronger fugitive slave law for the South. As far as the New Mexico territory, first of all, popular sovereignty in the Mexican cession. And what this means is that we will pass the buck. Harry Truman's not born yet, obviously. And we're going to pass the buck, and we're going to let the settlers decide the status of slavery in the Mexican cession. And then the next thing is that Texas will sell land, because there was some land that, Texas is just disputing everybody, that Texas comes into the Union, they were disputing with Mexico over their boundary, which they had been as a country. And then they come to the Union and they get into a dispute with the United States, where Texas says, we have Santa Fe, and the United States says, no, you don't. That's part of the Mexican cession. Well, Texas agrees to sell that land, and the federal government will assume Texas' war debt. All right, so that's going to be the quid pro quo there. So popular sovereignty in the Mexican cession, Texas sells land, gets its war debt assumed by the federal government. So 2 things going on out west. And finally, while we're at it, while we're all arguing about stuff, What about this slavery thing in Washington, D.C.? Now, there are two elements here. There are people who don't like slavery in the abstract, and then there are people who are really offended by the existence of really the slave trade. They find this offensive. Foreign visitors, when they come into the United States, they go to Washington, D.C., 20, 25, all that kind of stuff. Now, keep in mind, from the South's perspective, you've got these Southern congressmen that are coming into Washington, and they've got their body men, these slaves that are personally attached to them, that take care of them, that help them with their day-to-day stuff. So as a compromise, you take the people who want to get rid of slavery entirely and the people who feel like they've got their property rights from the South, and you abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. All right, so that is the last part of the Compromise of 1850. So you've got a switch between the North and the South, California, fugitive slave law, and then popular sovereignty in the Mexican Cession out west, then Texas cedes land in return for debt service, and then abolishing the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Keep in mind, it would be very easy for someone to trip you up on this if you don't know it. So the Compromise of 1850 is very important. Now, the Compromise of 1850 was supposed to be the final compromise between the sections. And I guess in a way it kind of was, but not in the way that Clay intended it. It's really for a different reason, that the 1850s are not going to be about compromise. Now, the 1830s, these were about compromise, that really if there's a difference, then we need to keep it quiet. We don't need to stir up controversy. In the 1830s, Congress had a gag rule about slavery when there were petitions presented from abolitionists. Congress would accept the petitions, but they would not debate them because that would cause trouble. Now, the 1850s, we see that this decade is characterized by conflict. All right, that we see here that it is more about advancing your sectional or moral interest at the expense of harmony. Keep in mind, from the point of view of the reformers, somebody like Garrison, slavery's wrong. And if I've got to stir up a little bit of trouble for the sake of what's right, I'll do that. And so we see that that's a very different mentality as the generation of Webster, Clay, and Calhoun passes out of politics and life, really, and is replaced by a generation of younger, more fiery politicians. So first of all, remember this fugitive slave law that happens, and you see the advent of personal liberty laws. So for example, like in Wisconsin and other states, this is de facto nullification. That what you see here is that they say that anybody that's accused of being a slave is going to get a jury trial, contrary to federal law. Now, they don't formally nullify federal law, but they are circumventing the federal law. And in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin is published. Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the impact here is that people start thinking about slavery. Although this is a work of fiction, when people read this stuff, they are very tied to it. I just finished the Mad Men series finale last night. Most high schoolers don't watch that, but you get very attached to certain characters. You were talking about your Archer show earlier, that really informs real life. Evidently, some of my students can't take ISIS seriously because that is the name of a spy agency that's inept. So fiction oftentimes influences the way that we perceive the real world. And think about like vampires and stuff. Like when I was growing up, it was like Dracula. People were scared of vampires. Now people are just like, oh, is he the good kind of vampire? He's so hot. Now, this is because somebody wrote a book. And because of like TV shows like Vampire Diaries. I like that show. I mean, I'm not going to knock it or anything. But it's changed the way that we look at vampires. Like my daughter, sometimes I fear for her because if she sees a vampire, she's not going to run. Not that it would help because they're fast and they'll get you. But still, it's like, people no longer have a healthy fear of vampires. Why not? Fiction. And this is the same thing that's happening. I would say that Uncle Tom's Cabin was kind of the twilight of the 1850s. And what happens here is we start to see the battle lines drawn more and more. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act takes this to a whole new level because popular sovereignty, this whole idea of the settlers deciding about slavery, seemed to be working okay in the West. So Stephen Douglas decides, let's push this Kansas-Nebraska Act and let's implement popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska. Now, the thing is, this was in the area of the Louisiana Purchase north of 3630. So really the Kansas-Nebraska Act is nullifying, it is superseding the Missouri Compromise. So we're going back on compromises that have already been made. And as a result here, this free soil movement gains more and more steam, and in 1854, the Republican Party is founded. This is a collection of Northern Whigs and Northern Free Soil Democrats. And keep in mind that the primary platform as it applies to the 1850s is a platform of free soil. There are anti-slavery people like abolitionists in the Republican Party, but the Republican platform is against the spread of slavery, against the expansion of slavery. And notice another thing about the Republican Party is that it's a sectional party. These are Northern Whigs and Northern Free Soil Democrats. So it is putting together a strategy to assemble political power in one section of the country rather than trying to found a national political party. And we see at this time, popular sovereignty doesn't work out so well in Kansas. Bleeding Kansas. This is happening in the late 1850s. 56 people killed during this time. Now keep in mind, this is during peacetime in a place that doesn't have a lot of people in it. People are shooting each other and burning down towns and all of that kind of stuff over slavery. Now the notable abolitionist involved here was John Brown, who was a violent abolitionist who believed that he was on a mission from God to end slavery. And if that needs violence in order to happen, then the end justifies the means. And then when you go back to Washington, you have the Brooks-Sumner incident. That's where Charles Sumner makes this speech. Now, I don't know what happened to my font on there, but it kind of messed up there. But Charles Sumner makes this really inflammatory speech about a guy from, it mentions a senator from South Carolina who was old and he wasn't feeling well and he wasn't there. And his nephew, Preston Brooks, ends up saying, like, look, he's told by his friends, you've got to go just beat this guy. You can't challenge him to a duel. He's not a gentleman. And Preston Brooks, boy, does he ever beat this guy. And we see here a northern cartoon where Preston Brooks is hitting this guy, and you can see that Preston Brooks's face is obscured. And Southerners are portrayed as just being really on the level of animals and brutes. And then you've got the issue of Dred Scott, or Dred Scott versus Sandford. Now what happens here is that Dred Scott was a slave, and he lived with his master in free territory and in a couple of free states, I believe, free state or two, for 2 years. And he sued for his freedom. He said, this makes me a free man. Now the Supreme Court doesn't respond well to this. The Supreme Court, which was dominated by Southerners at the time, this decision, first of all, Dred Scott, why are you here? Because the Constitution says, clearly, that people of African descent cannot be U.S. citizens. Now, if the Constitution says that, I've never seen it. It might be in that section with the National Bank and where, you can add land to the United States and all of that kind of stuff. Or all, maybe there's a little hidden section there. The Constitution never says anything about this, but evidently these judicial activists decide that that is the case. Then, Congress cannot forbid slavery in federal territory. This is a violation of property rights. So this whole idea of having free territory, slave territory, no good. And ergo, the Missouri Compromise, which had already been superseded by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is unconstitutional. So this idea of having any free territory, it's gone. All right, so you had places like Wisconsin, places like that, I guess. So you have this idea of a slave power conspiracy. All right, and a lot of people are really distrusting each other. And Abraham Lincoln gives his House Divided speech, where he says a house divided against itself cannot stand. And we start to see a lot of either-or reasoning here. And the lines are being drawn there. And John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry is another thing that happens kind of on the eve of the Civil War almost. And where he goes to Harper's Ferry, which at the time was in Virginia. I think it might be in West Virginia now. But he goes there and he goes to seize a federal arsenal. And he's going to arm slaves for a rebellion. Now this was a miserable failure, but it was still treason. All right, you seize a federal arsenal with the intent of starting a rebellion, you have committed treason. And he is convicted of treason and he is executed. All right, and so that, he's kind of like the Preston Brooks of the North, if you think. Like what Preston Brooks was as, a symbol of the South to the North, John Brown becomes a symbol of the North to the South. And you see a great deal of, in this case, John Brown is being applauded for what he did by an artist here. And you see a lot of paranoia. The North, there's a slave power conspiracy. They want slavery everywhere. In the South, the North plans to destroy slavery. Every Northerner is John Brown. To the North, every Southerner is Preston Brooks. And you see this distrust and paranoia that's really a big part of what's going on here. And in the 1860 presidential election, Abraham Lincoln is elected president, the first president to ever be elected without the support of a single slave state. And with this, the Deep South secedes, all right? That when Abraham Lincoln is elected, the Deep South secedes from the Union and starts the Confederate States of America. And that is a quick rundown of the causes of the Civil War as far as when we're leading up to the bit-by-bit chronology. So in the next segment, I am going to focus on the Civil War itself. I hope you will join me. See you in a bit.